Hello and welcome to the brand new American Reformation podcast with Tim Allman and Eric Fish. We long to see the wider American Christian church fall more in love with Jesus by learning from the practices of the early church and other eras of discipleship multiplication. We want to hear from you. Make sure you comment and leave a review wherever you're watching or listening to tell us what God is doing in your life or how you feel about today's conversation. Lord, have your way in us. Let's dive in.
Happy day. Welcome to the American Reformation podcast. Tim Allman here. Eric Fish is on dad duty today, but do not fret. We have a new friend of mine, a guest on the American Reformation podcast. His name is Bob Rucker. Now, let me introduce you to Bob. Bob has a fascinating story. Earned his master's in nuclear engineering from the University of Michigan. Worked in, man, I am out kicking my coverage today, Bob, by getting to chat with you. You are on another level of intellectual prestige here, brother. But he earned worked for the nuclear industry for 38 years, running nuclear analysis, computer calculations for advanced nuclear reactor design. There's a lot of nuclear going on there, Bob.
Yes.
And then performing statistical analysis on measurement data of fissile, and you're going to have to explain what that is. Am I saying that right? Fissile material?
Yes, fissile material is just an element that can fission, thus releasing tremendous amounts of energy, such as uranium-233 or plutonium-239.
And that explains your fascination with the topic for today. He has used this expertise for the last 9 years in his research on the Shroud of Turin. He has written 33 papers on the Shroud that are available on his research page at his website, shroudresearch.net. shroudresearch.net. And he organized a 4-day conference on the Shroud in 2017. His research has led him to develop a hypothesis to explain the main mysteries around the Shroud. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, Bob. I have not contemplated the mysteries of the Shroud much in my 15 years as a pastor. I think there probably was some misnomers that it was kind of a hoax, and I remember seeing it back in high school and college. But how did you develop this fascination, this love with the Shroud of Turin?
This goes way back. Maybe when I was 12 or 13 years old, I was delivering newspapers. And on Sunday morning, I delivered the Sunday papers. And when I got home, my parents were still in bed asleep. So I had time just to read the newspaper. And so the Sunday paper came out with a little magazine called Parade. And I was thumbing through it, and I saw a little tiny picture, maybe an inch high. And it just showed the face from the Shroud, very grainy, And I thought, what is that? And a little tiny article, 3 or 4 sentences. But the last sentence said, I remember it. Many people believe that this Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. And at the time, I thought, this can't possibly be, because that would be so popular, it would be so well known and revered that everyone would know about it.
Right.
And so then, maybe a couple of months, I never forgot the picture, but then I thought, a couple of months later, I thought, well, I need to be a little bit more open-minded than that about it. So I saw a book, I think it was in a Christian bookstore, and I bought it, and I read it, and then another one, and then another one. And so it just kind of finally grew on me. But, as I was working in nuclear, then I was just so busy, I couldn't do anything on it until after the carbon dating was done and the article came out, and I read it probably 2 or 3 years later. And I was sitting in the back of the library reading it, and I felt just a sinking feeling. I thought, well, the Shroud, based upon all the evidence, is authentic, but why is the carbon dating the way that it is?
Sure.
And at the time, I had 19 years experience in calculating neutron distributions in nuclear reactors. So I thought, I can solve this problem, and that's what I've done. So it took me probably 6 months of running calculations on it to resolve it, I think, to my satisfaction. And I think that there's actually 4 different evidences from the experimental carbon dating, not just one, there's 4. And the hypothesis that you come up with to answer the carbon dating has to be consistent with all 4. So that if it's just consistent with one, that is the average value that they came up with, then, but if it's just consistent with that one, but not the other 3, then it can't possibly be right.
Right. So
that's
wonderful.
what we've done.
That's so amazing. I sure appreciate your passion. I love just stepping back from your story. I wish there were more, just followers of Jesus, sitting in church for years, women and men who had experiences that would use those experiences to share. And this is, I'm a Lutheran, so vocation, the doctrine of vocation, and then sharing the gospel based on your gifting. This is such a strong value for me. So thank you for being obedient to the Holy Spirit in following this passion. So for those who are not aware, what is the Shroud of Turin? You said the burial cloth, but give a little bit more of what it is and its history, if you would.
Oh, sure. The word shroud is maybe not familiar to a lot of people, but a shroud is just a piece of cloth that a person is buried in. Caskets are expensive. Much easier to bury a person in a piece of cloth. And so Turin is a city in northwestern Italy. So the Shroud of Turin then refers to a particular burial cloth that's located in Turin, Italy. It's been there since 1578. We know that it arrived there from Lorraine, France. It was in Lorraine, France, starting about 1355 or 56. At that point, it was then exhibited in Lorraine, France, in a church as the burial cloth of Jesus.
Wow!
So just amazing. So that now let me give you kind of the majority opinion. There's a lot of debate on the Shroud of Turin, but the majority of opinion seems to be that this piece of cloth started in Jerusalem based upon pollen on the shroud and based upon Jerusalem limestone that was found in some of the dirt at the feet of the shroud. So it started in Jerusalem, maybe before 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed. It had to be evacuated prior to that. Probably went over to the coast and then up into Turkey, according to some of the ancient documents, and then over to Constantinople. There's uncertainty on these movements of the shroud because it was never called the Shroud of Turin until it arrived in Turin in 1578. So you have to be able to identify what piece of cloth they're talking about from the various descriptions. Is the Shroud of Turin the same as the Mendelian, for example? Is it the same as the Shroud of Edessa or the Shroud of Lorraine? So you have to go through that, and so that there's a lot of discussion. But I think there's good evidence that it was in Constantinople. Indeed, the first painting of the shroud, of the face, was made in about 550 AD. And that's called the Christ Pantocrator image. And that image was then transferred down through Byzantine art in the Byzantine Empire. And interesting enough, coins, the emperor, as he would be making coins for people to use in the empire, he would have his image on it. But the Shroud of Turin became so well known and so highly revered in the Byzantine Empire that the emperor took his image off the coins and put the image of the face onto the coins. And you can see that on my website. And that was about 692 AD. I have a gold Salatus from that, about that era, 692 to 695, showing the face from the Shroud of Turin. I also have a bronze coin from later, about 1025 to 1028, showing the face on one side. On the back side, it identifies who it is: Jesus Christ, King of Kings, in capital Greek. So I think we have certainty that the Shroud of Turin was available and well known and highly revered in the Byzantine Empire. How it got to Lorraine, France is not clear. There's several different concepts, and I'm not an expert on history. I go more into science than history on this. So is that enough background at this point?
You could have fooled me there, Bob. That was an amazing history lesson. And just to draw out, there were a number of, because relics were huge in the early church and then in the Roman Catholic and even Eastern Orthodox traditions, that there could be some other kind of counterfeit shrouds, right? Is that what we've kind of determined? And science helps us to understand how the Shroud of Turin is probably the most likely shroud?
Oh, yes, easily. Yes, I think I've heard a number of 42 different copies of the shroud. Now, for example, people would go to the little church in Lorraine, France in 1356 or so, and they would see it and they'd say, this is amazing, absolutely amazing. And it has to be authentic because there's no way that this could be produced by an artist. They didn't have the technique. And it was later proven that there's no pigment in the image. So it's not a painting. It's not due to paint, dye, or stain. So, but then they'd say, well, why can't we have this back in my church, back in Spain or in Italy? They would want something to take back to their church. So they would hire a painter to go in and do the best job that he could. Now, it's easy to tell which are the copies and which is the authentic original. Excuse me.
That's wonderful.
Yes. So that, it's easy to tell the difference between them. And that's why you can tell which is the original. And it is the Shroud of Turin.
Beautiful.
Because of the extreme difference between those that were copied from the original.
So before we get into the science, Bob, this is fantastic. Before we get into the science, give us the scripture from Galatians 3, verse 1. Now, I know Galatians very well, and I don't think I've ever read this text from the Apostle Paul with the Shroud of Turin as a lens. Would you read that for us? Or I can pull it up. Here's what it says. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Paul writes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. Before your very eyes, clearly portrayed. And you think this has some kind of a referent possibly to the Shroud of Turin. Say more there, Bob.
Yes. Well, Paul is referring to something that he showed them, okay, before their very eyes, so that they saw it. A lot of the commentaries, even the translations, take this as something that Paul was teaching them so clearly that they just had it in their mind. But I think the context of the verse, of what the verse is actually saying, this is something they saw with their eyes. And so what was it that showed the Jesus Christ crucified? What could it have been? And so the word there is prographo in the Greek. And grapho, of course, is very similar to our English word graphic. So, so it would be it can be translated as signboard. Well, that's a board with a sign on it. So it's a physical object that conveys information to people. Wow. That's put up in a public place. Well, what would that be? The only thing that I know of would be the Shroud of Turin. No, it doesn't say Shroud of Turin because it came into Turin in 1578, and the Bible was written long before that, of course. But it was something that was shown before their eyes. So what would it have been?
Yeah,
best guess is the Shroud of Turin.
Initially, I think.
So Paul was using it for apologetic and evangelistic work in Turkey in the early years, probably in the 40s or 50s.
Wow. I mean, initially, I think as I would look at this, I would have thought clearly portrayed that there were some Galatians, members of the body of Christ there in Galatia, who saw physically somehow during the post-resurrection, prior ascension, they actually saw Jesus raised from the dead. But because of the pro grapho, more display, the placarded, understanding, it's probably not his physical body, but more so possibly the shroud. Am I summarizing that correctly, Bob?
Yes. So at that point, of course, there would have been blood from his body on the inside of the wrapped shroud as it was wrapped across the body, so that Paul would be able to point to the blood, which would indicate crucifixion. But at that point, there would also be an image on the cloth where he could actually point to the front and back full-size image of a crucified man that was crucified exactly as the New Testament says that Jesus was crucified. This is absolutely amazing.
It is. So let's get more specific. Tell us about the shroud from a scientific perspective, because when I put a cloth over myself, or even a cloth over someone who I can understand who was buried as deceased, I don't know that an image gets actually portrayed onto that cloth. But obviously, the shroud shows us something different. So let's get into the science, Bob.
Yes, I was just trying to bring up one of my other items for me to look at as I'm talking here. But the science of this is absolutely amazing. The first photograph of the shroud was taken in 1898, and up to that point in 1898, they thought, well, this must be some kind of a painting. But in 1898, Segunda Pia, who was an attorney and an amateur photographer, photography was just kind of coming into vogue at that point. And he had one of these very large cameras, and he went in during an exhibition of the shroud, which only occurs, several times a century.
Wow.
5 or 6 times a century, usually to commemorate important events. But Segunda Pia went in, he took pictures of the shroud and in particular of the face. So afterwards, then, he took this huge box camera back to his dark room, probably under the red light, and he had his glass plate, this large glass plate in the container of fixer, and he was developing the image. And as it came up, he almost dropped it.
Oh, wow.
Because he was so shocked at what he saw. Because as you look at the shroud itself, it's a very dim image, and you're not really clear as to what you're looking at. But on the photograph, it was a clear, positive image of a face, of a human face. And so he immediately reasoned back that meant that what was on the shroud was a negative image, with the positive and negative parts of the photograph reversed.
Yes.
Well, now that had a meaning though, because at that point nobody would have known how to paint a negative image, because no one had seen one at that point in history in 1898.
Right.
The camera had just been invented, but so he realized that the image on the shroud was a negative image. So it couldn't be a painting.
Right.
So what was it?
Right.
Well, he didn't know. And so he lost all of his credibility as a human being and as an attorney, because people kept saying that's impossible, you're faking this, you're trying to deceive us in some way. And he had to live with that from 1898 up to 1931, when the next photograph was taken by a man Italian named Henry, and it came up with the same result. But nevertheless, those people who believed him in 1898 started doing science on the Shroud of Turin. And I'm trying to remember his name. I don't have my notes here in front of me.
Okay.
But there was a very famous French scientist who had discovered how the inner ear functioned to allow us to hear things. And he was fascinated by this. Yves Delage, I believe was his name. I love that name, Yves Delage.
That's
But
awesome.
anyway, he started researching it, and over 2 years, he had an assistant working with him who then researched for the next 42 years. But Yves Delage in 2 years came up with a conclusion and reported it at the prestigious Science Academy in Paris, that he believed that this was the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. And the academy, the building was overflowed with people at that point to hear it. The first time since Lister had announced his results on bacteria, discovery of bacteria. But interesting enough, there was enough people that was opposed to what he was saying. It was never recorded.
Why were they opposed?
Because they were atheists. They cannot tolerate the concept that the Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, and that the image was produced by a mechanism that is not within our understanding of the laws of physics.
So explain that mechanism. Explain that mechanism.
Yeah. What was that mechanism?
Yeah, explain the mechanism that's not tolerated by the laws of physics.
Oh, yes. Well, this is why it took me 9 years of research on the Shroud to try and sort all of this out, because there's so many different evidences. Let me move forward from 1898 up to about 1973. The main researchers worked on the blood on the Shroud, concluding that due to the pristine appearance of the blood and the serum halos. Now, the serum halos were not visible to the unaided eye, but they are visible under ultraviolet light. But that showed that there was capillarity of the blood, and that even the shape of the blood as it's hardened, higher edges, lower center, all that indicated that it was that there was a real human being wrapped in the Shroud, and that it's his blood that's on the cloth. So in 1973, John Jackson, working at professor of physics at the Air Force Academy, put a photo of the Shroud under what's called a VP8 image analyzer. And that was an electronic device that causes a readout of three-dimensional image in a picture. And so what they obtained on the oscilloscope was a realistic-looking image of a face with the proper depth of the eyes, the prominence of the nose, the cheeks in order and all. That doesn't happen if you put a photograph of a person under the VP8 image analyzer. But it did occur with the Shroud of Turin. Absolutely amazing. What that indicated was the Shroud of Turin, which is a 2D image, it has X and Y dimension, but that image contains three-dimensional information regarding how a statue would look if you backed out the three-dimensional image properly. Just amazing. Now, satellite telemetry data, as a satellite circles Venus or Mercury, as it sends down a radio wave, reflects back, that telemetry data sent back to the Earth contains three-dimensional information. So does the Shroud of Turin.
Wow. And
how can that be? So that with that, and just looking at the image, there's the other two main things that were discovered is that the discoloration, the image is caused by discoloration of the fibers. And a thread contains about 100 or more fibers within the thread, all twisted together. And that the discoloration is only on the top, one or two, maybe three fiber layers in the thread. It doesn't penetrate into the thread. It's just the surface fibers. Now, a linen fiber, this is a linen cloth made from the flax plant. A linen fiber is about 1/5 the diameter of a human hair. It would be 15 to 20 microns or micrometers in diameter. And then, so it's only the top two layers of fibers. And then when they looked at the fiber to find out where the discoloration was, they couldn't see it because it was thinner than a wavelength of light. It's less than 0.2 microns or micrometers all around the circumference of the fiber. So now that would have to be detected by an electron microscope. So this is just absolutely amazing. How would that occur?
So that means he didn't wear, does that mean whoever was wearing the shroud didn't wear it, I'm just speaking elementary here, didn't wear it for very long?
Well, how long did he wear it? he was buried in it,
Right.
but there's no decay products
Right.
on the cloth. So he exited. He was less than about 2 days within the cloth. Well, that's consistent with Scripture.
Sure is.
You start to have body decay products after about 2 days in the cloth. But when they discovered this three-dimensional information, John Jackson, who discovered that, then formed a research project, the Shroud of Turin research project, which included eventually about 40 different scientists from leading universities and industry or companies in the country. And they were allowed to go to Turin, Italy, and do research, every experiment that they could imagine to determine what caused the image. So they worked for 5 days in 24 hours a day. And they took, I think, $2.5 million worth of equipment with them. And what they found was that there's no pigment on the cloth, so it can't be due to paint, dye, or stain. That it's not a scorch because it doesn't fluoresce under ultraviolet light. That it's not due to any liquid because there's no capillarity in the image. And that it's not a photograph because of the presence of the three-dimensional information. So how do you deal with all that? One important item here is that the nose would have been touching the cloth. Okay. It would have been resting on the nose because the nose is up above the rest of the face. But the nostril would not have been in contact with the cloth. Yet the nostril is imaged on the cloth, so that therefore the image mechanism is not due to contact.
So what is it due to?
Well, it has to be something that went across the air gap between the body and the cloth.
So you say, Bob, you have some new research that is about to be released, or maybe it is, and you're just exploring how to release it. You are coming to share for a full day presentation at Christ Greenfield on this entire story, this research. I mean, we're just skimming the top of the iceberg here. So, but give us a little bit more of your new research that's about ready to come out to help make sense of this.
Yes. Well, I've written 33 papers.
That's a lot.
That's on the research page of my website, shroudresearch.net. And it's not that this is new research. I've made probably 50 different presentations in various venues, churches, libraries, technical conferences, etc. And so this is not new, but it's just getting the information out to people. Mm-hmm. And so the pastors there at this church in Gilbert, Arizona, saw some of my work, were fascinated by it, called me, and we talked, and I suggested, well, let's organize a conference, and I'll come down, and so I'm preparing 6 one-hour presentations, PowerPoint presentations, that will turn into a full-day conference, and
it's wonderful.
I'm just hoping I'm going to be able to speak that long, but so basically what we've come up with is that what is it that could communicate the information? Information is the key here, because you have to be able to deposit the information on the cloth to form a good resolution image. So what can do that?
I have no idea.
What can communicate information?
Yeah, I don't know. Did something happen, like a metaphysical? I mean, did he? I mean, obviously, I believe at the core of everything that I am, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, your faith is futile. You're still in your sins. So I'm going to say right now, I don't need the Shroud of Turin to let me know Jesus bodily rose from the dead. I have eyewitness reports. I've got all the different rationale around how the early church message blew up because he actually was raised from the dead. The Apostle Paul and all of the apostles experienced life with him, as well as, Mary and the women coming to the tomb, seeing it's empty. Like that's ultimately why I believe. And yet I am fascinated by the moment the Father said, "Son, come back to life." Did some kind of flashpoint, I don't know what else to say from a scientific perspective, did some sort of flashpoint come that put that image onto that burial cloth? Say more about that, Bob.
Yes, my conclusion here is that radiation is the only thing that could communicate the information. For example, when you're looking at me, when I'm looking at you, how is it that we see each other? It's because photons of light carry the information regarding colors, shades, and positions of the person to our body. Now, on a camera, they carry that information through the lens to the film or electrical components of the camera and deposit the information so that information is used to make a photograph, which you look at. Reflected photons then carry the information to our eyes. When those photons hit the rods and cones at the back of our eyes, that information is translated into the electrical signals that travel up our optic nerves to our brains, and our brains have learned to interpret that information as the image of a person. That's what's going on. Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing.
Yes. And so photons, any kind of radiation, whether photons of electromagnetic radiation, such as visible light or ultraviolet light or infrared light, can carry information. So can particles, such as neutrons, protons, and electrons can carry information. So that in our cell phones, the information is carried on electrons flowing in wires, for example. But it's all about information. And so when I look at all the evidence from what we know, the very thin discoloration of the fibers, the 3D information, there's only one option that can make this, that I can figure out, and that is that there was an extremely brief, extremely intense burst of radiation from the body. Now, that just follows from science alone. I come up with that conclusion. It has to be an extremely brief burst of radiation, intense, brief burst of radiation. What kind of radiation? The image it was partially, part of the mechanism here was an electrostatic discharge or static discharge, electrical discharge from the top fibers. That's why it's only the top, 1 or 2, 3 layers of fibers. Had to be an electrical discharge from those fibers to the body. And what would cause that? Well, the radiation burst has to be protons from within our cell. Where would protons come from? Well, the best concept is that it's from the fission of deuterium atoms. Now, deuterium is also called heavy hydrogen. This would be hydrogen. It chemically behaves just like hydrogen, but it not only has a proton in the nucleus, but also a neutron. And when that splits, because deuterium can split with the lowest amount of input energy to it. That's why we choose deuterium to suggest as to be the atom that split. But then what happens when a deuterium atom would split was the proton would go in one direction, the neutron exactly the opposite direction because of conservation of momentum. So that, for example, if the proton is going up, then the neutron's going down. Now, in order to form the very thin discoloration on the fiber, what do you have to have? You have to have the electron flow just in that very thin region of the fiber. Now, what would cause that? Well, in an alternating current, the electron flow is just in the outer circumference of the conductor. Okay? So that's the only mechanism that I know of. You have to have an extremely high frequency alternating current in the fibers to discolor just that very thin region. Well, what would cause that high frequency alternating current in the fibers? Well, it would be that if this proton emission were alternating between vertically up and vertically down directions very rapidly, that would cause an alternating current in the fibers. So step by step, I've just followed the evidence where it leads. Okay? Not referring to scripture,
right.
Just following the science. So it has to be an extremely rapid alternating up versus down emission of protons from the body. Now, how many protons, how many neutrons? See, in the emission of the neutrons, those neutrons would then be absorbed in nitrogen 14 in the cloth, which would kick out a proton, thus changing the nitrogen 14 atom to carbon 14, which would shift the carbon date forward in the forward direction. So using my nuclear analysis computer calculations, I can calculate how many neutrons would have to be emitted. So therefore, we also know how many protons were emitted. It's 2 times 10 to the 18th. That's 2 followed by 18 zeros.
Okay.
Well, how many were in the body? I can calculate that. There's 2 about for 170, 175 pound person. You'd have about 2 times 10 to the 28th neutrons and protons in the human body.
Right.
So that would mean that you'd only have to emit 1 out of every 10 billion neutrons to cause the shift in the carbon date that was detected by the 3 laboratories that the 3 samples were sent to from the carbon dating. Am I getting, what do you think about all this?
Well, one, you just gave a scientific explanation for the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So that's cool.
Yes, the only explanation for how a dead body could emit this radiation, if you look through all of the documentation that humanity has, there's only one person and one event that this can refer to. It has to be Jesus in the resurrection. There's no other option, just from science.
I agree with you, because I was going to ask a question earlier, Bob, like, couldn't this be any crucified guy? Rome's crucifying lots of people. There's not a chance.
Not a chance. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
They wouldn't. A dead body does not emit such a burst of radiation.
And so I think a lot of the carbon dating, one of the last questions here as we're coming down the home stretch. So explain how carbon dating goes back to the 1st century, rather than, I think some people were saying, this is a fake from just hundreds of years ago, not maybe a couple thousand. Talk about the carbon dating and get as elementary as you can in terms of the carbon dating, Bob.
Yes. The samples were sent to 3 different laboratories in Tucson, Arizona, Oxford, England, and Zurich, Switzerland. And carbon dating is a destructive process. So the samples that were sent to them were cut from right next to each other. So it was different samples sent to these 3 laboratories. But the 3 laboratories didn't come up with the same answers. Now, that should tell you that there's something strange going on.
Sure.
Because they should be the same within their uncertainty range, but they weren't. So that what it tells you is that the carbon date depended on, or was a function of, the location on the shroud. It shouldn't be, but it was. Now that tells you that something was going on. So that the carbon date is more recent as you move toward the center of the body. It's older as you move toward the bottom of the cloth. Now, it's interesting, when I did my nuclear analysis computer calculations, that's exactly what my nuclear calculation showed. It showed that there should be a cosine distribution where it came up, it peaked over the center of the body, and then came down at the head and down at the feet. So down at the feet, where the samples were taken, it showed the same slope that the laboratories indicated in their experiments. So I think I've discovered here the cause of it. Now, you also have the carbon date from the sudarium. Now, the sudarium is the face cloth that was over his face to catch the blood that was coming out of his nose and his mouth. We believe that we have that in Oviedo, Spain, based upon the historical documents that arrived with it in the 800s in Oviedo, Spain. And so that was dated to 700 AD. Well, and thus they thought, well, they can't possibly be the authentic sudarium. Why would it date to 700? Well, because it was taken off the body and set aside. And in my calculations, if the person, I think it was the Apostle John doing the burial in the pit or stand-up area in the tomb, he would have taken off that face cloth and just, most people are right-handed, and just dropped it, even with his body, on the side bench. And when I looked in my calculations that had been done, that date for a piece of linen cloth gave 700 AD, the same as the experiments had determined. Absolutely amazing.
So I'm still, and again, I'm a pastor. When I hear you saying 700 AD, the experiments went to 700 AD, don't we have to get back to first century AD?
Okay. So, well, what we're saying here,
bridge that gap for me.
Yes. So that we have the date from the cloth. We have the distribution as it moves. If you sample various points across the shroud, my prediction is that about 70% of the Shroud of Turin would date to the future from today because of new carbon-14 produced on the cloth from neutron absorption in nitrogen-14. Okay, so that has to be explained. That's not explained by simply assuming that the cloth dates from 1260 to 1390, which is the most common. That only explains one of the four items. You not only have the average date, you have the distribution, the slope across the 3 points. We have the distribution. There's also a Y distribution going on here of the actually 16 subsample dates. So they took the samples, cut them into subsamples. We actually have 16 measurements, not just one. We have 16 data points on the shroud, and we have 2 or 3 on the sudarium. So all of that evidence has to be explainable.
Right.
And the only option to explain all of this data is neutron emission from the body.
Cool. So again, elementary, it's way deeper than just the carbon dating sample. We have to look at all of the data. And go ahead.
Yes. So there's 13 or 14 other date indicators from the Shroud of Turin, all of which are earlier than the carbon date, and all of which are inconsistent with the carbon date.
Oh,
so
bad.
Yes, the carbon date has to be rejected.
Good.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's what I wanted to hear you say. Wow, Bob, this is just a teaser. This is hopefully if you are in the Gilbert, East Valley of Phoenix area, our team here at Christ Greenfield, I'm one of the pastors at Christ Greenfield. Our team's going to be recording this and getting it out. But please sign up to come hang out with us. You can go to christgreenfield.church, or Trey Cox is your closest connection. If you just wanted to email tcox@cglchurch.org, tcox@cglchurch.org. We would love to have you join us that day. And if you want to geek out with Bob, the best place to do that is shroudresearch.net. shroudresearch.net. I got it pulled up here, and you do a marvelous job of clearly explaining everything that you've verbally shared with us today, Bob. I'm going to say this as I close. The joy of Jesus and your passion to share the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the blood of Christ, and it's not just kind of this spiritual other reality. I mean, the early church stood on the blood. They actually saw the blood. They saw the nail marks, and they saw the cloth that for us now, thanks to science is in our favor as Christians, said there's no other explanations but the bodily resurrection of Jesus, who is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, to be worshiped and praised for all eternity, the one who is quick to return to make everything wrong right again. Oh, hasten the day, King Jesus. Until that day comes, Bob, you keep doing what you do. Being a scientist, being curious, and sharing the message of the resurrection with as many who will hear. And we pray by the Spirit's power, come to faith. Bob, thank you so much for this time. Any last word, brother, on what this means?
Yes. If people would like to communicate with me, I'd like to give my email.
Sure.
It's my name, Robert A. Rucker, R-U-C-K-E-R, at yahoo.com. Robert A. Rucker, R-U-C-K-E-R, at yahoo.com.
Beautiful. Thank you, Bob. This was a joy. This is the American Reformation Podcast. Every single week, we come out with a fresh conversation. If you also hear connected to Unite Leadership Collective, lead time episodes coming out. Let me be very clear. A lot of the lead time episodes are way more for leaders doing kind of specific leadership functions within the church, specifically in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. But we are proud, Eric Fish and I, my co-host, are proud to have conversations on American Reformation Reformation that go far beyond the corners of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And Bob, you have done just that for us today. We'll be back next week with American Reformation. Sharing is caring. Please get the word out, and we will see you next week. Peace of the Lord go with you. Thanks, Bob.